this afternoon, a man who is an icon in the town of Hanson. For those of us that have lived here in town for many years, I'm sure have all benefited from his gardening and landscaping advice. Les Wyman is a professional landscaper and gardener who founded Wyman's Nursery. His book that he's going to talk about today is a compilation of articles from a column Mr. Wyman wrote for the Brockton Enterprise beginning in 1970. His daughter, Joanne Colley, nice to have you here, edited and helped to publish the book. Without further ado, I give you Mr. Wyman.
Oh, thank you, Nancy. Nancy is our town librarian, and I have to thank her for the work that she and her staff put into setting up this program this afternoon. The book, Grassroots, which you see displayed right here, as Nancy said, is material that appeared as a column that my wife and I wrote for the Brockton Enterprise, and I don't know how many years ago it was, and I don't know how many years we did it, but Joanne found 700 of these columns stashed away in a cellar down on Pleasant Street. And some of you know Sam Hammond. He's been living in town for 85 years, so he's an old timer here in town, longer than I've been here, and I've been around for quite a few years. But anyway, Sam had saved these columns. He told me one day he was doing it, stashing them away in an old bureau drawer in the cellar. So when Joanne said she couldn't find the columns because it was her idea to do this book, so I said, Joanne, I don't know. I didn't save the columns. I didn't use a computer where you just typed it on an old Selectric typewriter. She checked with libraries, she checked with the newspaper, nothing. But I said, wait a minute, Sam can help you. So we called Sam, I called Sam in her behalf, and she said, sure, because Joanne lives up in Portland, so it's not just here and there. But she got the columns, and she went through them, picked out 200 maybe, to start out. She says she might do a second book, but the hours she put in, if she was paid minimum wage for doing this book, she could retire, because she really did a fabulous job, and you'll have a chance to see the book a little later on. But Grassroots came about because Paul Salters, who used to be one of the editors for the Enterprise, he's retired now, but Paul came to me one day, he said, Les, would you do a garden column? We're going to have to do a garden page in the newspaper once a week. Or was it every other week? I said, sure, I'll give it a try, Paul. So I wrote out a column in longhand on legal pads, and Marion, who's sitting right here, typed it for me. She had the woman's touch toward the end, so I said, look, this isn't me, so I inserted one line from Mrs. Garden Writer. And she talked about the kids, the grandchildren, the birds, et cetera, et cetera. So that bottom half is not my doings, it's Marion's doings, Mrs. Garden Writer. So Joanne didn't put her name in the introduction to the book, but she should have. That was an oversight, I guess you could say. But we had fun doing it. And when I saw what Paul was doing, the bottom part of the column is the credits. And if you read a newspaper article, you always see the name of the author, the writer, toward the end. That's called the shirt tail. And the shirt tail in our column gave the facts that I was a garden writer. I ran a nursery and garden center located on Spring Street in Hanson, and if you have questions, send a note. So here's a free ad. He's paying me to write the column, but he's giving me a free ad. So thank you, Paul. I began to write the column every week, and then when the Sunday edition came on, a few years later, I wrote a column for Sunday also. So we were doing 2 columns every single week, and here we are again. This is only 1/3 of the columns that I wrote in this book. So maybe someday, who knows? So what's in the book? Well, all sorts of information. Joanne did a tremendous job. Starting at the end, she has an index, and the index cites every sort of information you can think of. You turn to the page in the book that she has mentioned in the index, and there you are. Not all garden information, obviously. There's a lot of garden information that couldn't possibly go in a book the size of this one. But she had fun doing it, and I've had fun reading it. So she showed up last Christmas with 2 shopping bags full of books. Well, I know she was thinking of doing it, and I didn't realize she was going to go through and finish the job. But these 2 shopping bags full of books for our family members who were at our Christmas celebration, and that was the end of that first printing. So we called a printer, and this printer in southern Maine does a fabulous job, just a small print shop, I'm sure, because you call in with an order and you'll have the books in a week or 10 days. So what print shop around here can do that? I mean, they want 2 or 3 months to do a printing. So I've got more books coming. So if there aren't enough here today, there'll be more coming. I've got another shipment coming in next week. So just some of the topics that are mentioned in Grassroots, and of course it's written by me, edited by Joanne Gawley. That's her married name. And she has a family tree with each of our children listed, and they're placed in the book where you can find something mentioned about them. So in the introduction she says, and this was part of our radio show introduction. We did a radio show on WATD Marshfield for a number of years. How many? 7 or 8 years? 7. And they promised a promo for today's presentation, but I didn't hear the promo on ATD. So they let me down, or maybe they ran the program late at night. But anyway, this is how our radio program started. Inch by inch, row by row, gonna make this garden grow. All it takes is a rake and a hoe and a piece of fertile ground. Well, there's really more than that, I'm sure. If you've ever taken upon yourself to do a little work in the garden, inch by inch, row by row, someone bless these seeds I sow. Someone warm them from below till the rain comes tumbling down. Wasn't it the guitar players, Peter, Paul, and Mary, didn't they sing this? Okay, so that was how we started off our garden show on radio, and we did this once a week, 1 hour. And you know, you hear a radio show going on, and it sounds pretty simple, but when you do the program on the other host, you've got to prepare for it. In the preparation, as Marion mentioned, you know, I had a catalog with me one day, and I'm preparing for the show by reading about certain things in the catalog. So it was fun, but it was kind of a chore. But we kept it up for 6, 7 years, maybe longer. And in fact, I met some of the people at ATD Radio last week when I asked if they could put on a public service announcement. Sure, we'll do it for you. So we recorded the message, 30 seconds, that's all they give you for free. But they do promise to run this for, you know, several times. Well, I don't know how many times they ran it, when it was. But these lyrics of the gardening song written by David Mallet opened a Saturday morning gardening program on ATD FM in Marshfield, hosted by Marion and Les Wyman. That is another story. In these pages are selected articles of the newspaper column Les wrote for the Brockton Enterprise, the Grassroots. I searched for these Grassroots columns for years. This is from Joanne. For years and years, searching online, writing letters, talking with librarians and local folks, nothing proved fruitful. And then one day the phone rang. It was Dad saying that he had just talked with Sam Hammond. I've known Sam forever. He was on the fire department with me. He was also in the Masons with me. You know, our paths have crossed innumerable times. It was Sam. Ted just talked to Sam Hammond, and I should call him about some boxes he had found. I was to have my columns after all. Sam's boxes held not only some of Dad's long-lost clippings, but 732 columns, all carefully clipped and stowed away in cardboard boxes. So he gave up the bureau drawers. So I began a long process of assembling some of them into this book. I scanned each to create a digital version, and then edited and edited and edited. Joanne even gave me some to check the spelling and the grammar and so forth. So. You tell them she's a teacher in the meantime. Oh, that's right. She had a full-time job. I selected articles, formatted them to fit these pages, and proofread. Thank you, Ryan, Betsy, and Billy Joe, and a few others too. As I edit, I can hear Dad's voice telling me stories about trees and flowers as we walk through the woods and as we tour his gardens. I love those walks. I can hear Mom talk about flowers and birds and cooking and the family members. As you read, maybe you will hear them too. And quite often, Joanne would see a certain plant, and so part of that, maybe a clipping or a seedling, would be hers the next time she came down. I'd have it already in a container. So without dates, the columns included here in no particular order. Spring sits happily beside fall. If you play a little game as you read, you might be able to decode column publication dates. We didn't have any dates in these columns. I didn't think they'd ever see the light of day after I wrote them. using descriptions of gardening activities and the birthday clues on our family tree. When I asked Dad about his articles, he said, I first started with the Enterprise about 1970. That's a long time ago, isn't it? But they're about some years before we built here on Tavern Way, probably 35 years ago when we lived on Spring Street. At first, the column was in the paper on Thursdays. When it became a regular thing, Paul Salters, who was an editor, asked me to do a column for the new Sunday edition. First published September 13th, 1981. So we do have a few dates. I said, why not fire them off one every Sunday? And they printed them. We had a few years on Thursdays and Thursday and every other Sunday. I used to write it out in mom type. I found that 2.5 pages legal pad was just about right for the column. I used to write it out in mom type before the days of computers. She started to add her stuff, and I added from Mrs. Garden Writer. I never used a computer but sent it electronically with some sort of gadget that our son Phil set up. Mom taught us how to press leaves and flowers. There were always bits of blossoms appearing pressed between pages, especially inside larger books. Even today, some stray petals can sometimes be discovered when we're flipping pages of some of the books that we have in the house. So as time goes on, some horticultural practices change, as with all things. Some treatments for pests and plant conditions included here are no longer used. No longer is it recommended to apply pruning paint when trimming tree branches. I noticed that my son still has some pruning paint on the shelf in the store. I don't know who he sells it to, because it can actually do harm to the tissue of your tree when you paint after you've done a pruning job. Some products are no longer available. For example, Rapid Grow, a staple gardening fertilizer that's a liquid form, a soluble fertilizer, has been discontinued. There have been changes in the uses of gardening chemicals. These are included here, as these are the columns as Les originally wrote them, and these were all accepted horticultural practices at the time. So she developed a table of contents, and every single article is annotated here, starting with Dawn Redwood, a living fossil. Now, the Dawn Redwood, maybe some of you know it, and if you open the screen in the back of the room, you can see a Dawn Redwood on the grounds of the Indian Head School. That tree is now probably 75 feet tall. Well, that was the result of Carol Gagnon's work with the kids. He was a principal over at the Indian Head School for a number of years. And Carol got the kids together one year to do a tree planting project on Arbor Day, which I think is, the third Friday in April, I'm not sure. So I suggested to Carol, why don't we plant a Dawn Redwood? Well, what's that? So I had to go through the whole spiel. What is the tree? Where did it come from? And the kids, I don't know how many of them today remember the story about the Dawn Redwood, but it has a fascinating story. A Chinese botanist was out looking for unusual trees and shrubs and plants, and he came upon a small grove of trees that he didn't know. So he took specimens back to the laboratory, and they checked them out, and they found that they were identical to fossils of the Dawn Redwood that had been found all over the northern hemisphere. So an expedition was sent to China, northwest China, way up in the boondocks, as we used to call it in the Marine Corps. So they brought back seed, and the seed was distributed to plant growers all over the northern hemisphere. So the Dawn Redwood is now growing again where it existed millions of years ago. Why it went out of business, why it died out in all these places on Earth where fossils have been found, nobody knows. But a few lived, reproduced, and it was there that the botanists found those few specimens. So the Dawn Redwood, a deciduous conifer. What's a conifer? A conifer is a cone-bearing plant, like hemlock and pine and spruce and arborvitae and on and on. There are about 20 or 30 different species of plants that are cone-bearing. But some of these cone-bearing plants don't produce cones as we know them. The juniper, how many people know the juniper? The juniper produces a blue berry. The yew, you might not know the yew now because it's just candy for deer. They love to feed on yew branches, yew foliage. But the fruit of the yew is a red berry. So there are a few other conifers that don't have a cone as you know it, like the cone you'll see on a pine tree or a hemlock or something like that. So this conifer is deciduous. It drops its needles in the fall. And the evergreens, the conifers that we know that are commonly grown, I'm looking out at pine trees in the back of the building, And those trees keep their needles year-round, but they do shed one crop of needles each year, and a new crop will grow. So the tree is evergreen in that it will always have needles when you see the tree. So a deciduous plant, a deciduous tree or deciduous shrub, will drop its needles or leaves in the fall and produce a new crop of needles or leaves the following year. So this is unusual in a needle-type plant, such as the Dawn redwood. Those needles looks a lot like a hemlock. If you know the hemlock, those needles drop in the fall. So a deciduous conifer, a really unusual situation in the plant world. There are others too. Does anybody else know of a conifer that drops its needles? How about the trees that grow in the swamps in northwest Florida and eastern Alabama? They grow in standing water. The pond or bald cypress, that tree will also drop its needles. And if you want to check me out, you can come and see a tree growing in my garden. Here we are, how many, 1,500, 2,000 miles away from where the tree grows as a native, but it still lives and is hardy enough to live, and it doesn't have to have this standing water, but will tolerate the standing water. So that's a second deciduous conifer. The golden larch is another one. And if you go north into Maine and New Hampshire, in fact, my daughter's daughter, Billy Joe, brought me a small plant of the larch one time. Because she did her graduate work up in Nova Scotia, where the larch, or tamarack is the Indian name, grew wild all over the place. So that's another deciduous conifer. So anyway, the Dawn redwood has this interesting history, and there are big trees here and there. Mrs. Mann, whose son Charlie Mann was a state rep here in this district for many years, and I think he was state senator also after he first served as a state representative. Well, Charlie's mother, I think Mrs. Gordon Mann, lived on Winter Street near the corner of East Washington. For those people who live nearby, the corner of East Washington and Winter, and just north of there, going toward Hanover, to the second house, there's a large Dawn redwood on that property. You can see it from the street. There's another one on the grounds of the First Church in Pembroke. So very, very hardy tree, very unusual in that it drops its needles in the fall. Then another article was about getting berries on a holly tree. Well, what was that one all about? Because people always want to know about berries on a holly tree. Now, all hollies are not alike. We have the American holly, which grows in the woods around here. I have dug up many of them, and I have them in my garden now. Dug them when they're small. Don't attempt to dig a holly tree out of the woods that's 3 or 4 or 5 feet tall. It won't survive. But the little ones will. It takes a little time for this plant to develop, but it's perfectly amenable to being transplanted and being grown in a garden situation. So that's the American holly. But it's only the female plants bearing female flowers that will produce fruit, if there's a male nearby, within maybe 100 yards. They don't have to be right next to each other. So a lady at church, excuse me, a widow lady wanted to do something at church on the grounds to remember her husband who passed away last year. So I said, how about a blue holly? Now, blue holly is very, very commonly grown as an ornamental tree. The leaves aren't blue, they're shiny green, they're not spiny like the leaves on an American holly, but very, very hardy. The deer like the blue holly, by the way, so you've got to do something about deer foraging. But the blue holly is a great ornamental, very, very popular. Again, blue holly is either male or female. How about blue girl? That's a female. How about blue stallion? That's a male. There are about 12 or 14 of these blue hollies developed by Kathleen Meserve down in Long Island. And I think she won awards for doing this work with holly, producing these new varieties. So that's a great holly. Again, you have to have male and female. Blue girl, blue angel, blue princess, they're all female plants. So Mrs. Roe, we call her Roe Peterson, she said, how about some kind of a plant for the grounds at the church? I said, gee, I've got an idea for you. My son had some hollies in containers, and they're bisexual. The grower, the propagator, when these plants are very small, put a male plant and a female plant in the same container. And they grew on, and looking at this plant now, you'd think it was all one plant, but it's 2 in 1. So you don't have to have the second plant, within 50 feet or 100 feet. You get it all in one spot. So Ro was flabbergasted. She said, "This is great." So we purchased a plant for her and planted it, and now it's growing, doing very, very well. So you have berries on part of the plant, just the female part of the plant, but you won't have berries. You'll have only the male flowers on the other part of the plant. So people come to me occasionally and say, what kind of a holly is this? Well, you've got to look at the leaves, look at the flowers when they are produced in the spring, and there is a distinct difference between the male flowers and the female flowers on holly. Okay, here's a question. I had questions and answers on some of the columns. This one is, our early tomatoes are blossoming, but most of the flowers are dropping off. My son-in-law grows a lot of tomato plants in his garden. Do you ever have this happen, Bill? But some of those early blossoms do drop off, and the reason is that if the night turns cold when the plant is blossoming, those plants will not produce fruit. The blossom will just drop off. So sometimes that's the answer. You're producing a fine, healthy plant, making a lot of growth, developing flowers, but some of those early flowers, when the nights are cold, don't produce fruit. Many varieties of tomatoes will set fruit only within a narrow range of night temperatures. Temperatures above 55 degrees Fahrenheit for at least part of the night are required for the first fruit set. Night temperatures above 75 degrees Fahrenheit will cause blossom drop. Some early fruiting tomatoes have been especially bred to set fruit at lower night temperatures, which we sometimes experience early in the growing season. You can sometimes improve fruit set by shaking or jarring the flower cluster. They use a little gadget in the greenhouses where they grow tomatoes, and it's run by a battery, and it vibrates. So the grower will go along and he'll touch every tomato plant in the entire greenhouse with this little gadget, and it causes the branches to kind of flutter, and they have pollination because there aren't any insects in the greenhouse. You can sometimes improve fruit set by shaking or jarring the flower cluster. Do this at midday when it is warm and the humidity is low. A spray is available which will help fruit set also. Another question. This is in the column, temperature controls blossom drop. Will watering our plants in hot weather cause leaf burn? No. If anything, plants will be cool and the transpiration rate will drop. It is an old wives' tale that drops of water on leaves will burn foliage of plants. Another question. Our Pachysandra planting is looking very poor. The leaves do not have a good dark green color, and some of the plants are dying. Well, Pachysandra is an evergreen. It creeps along the ground, and I gave a few plants away at the plant sale recently. But Pachysandra makes a good evergreen, creeping ground cover. It grows about 4 to 6 inches tall. There are varieties that have very, very glossy leaves. But sometimes Pachysandra doesn't do well. Look very carefully at the stems, and you might see little black, they look like miniature oyster shells. Well, this is oyster shell scale. It's a common pest of certain kinds of plants, and it's easy to control by spraying with an oil spray. When I say oil, this will be a horticultural oil. So horticultural oil is great for certain kinds of sucking insects. So you don't see holes in the leaves when the plant is infested with this scale, but you will see the scale on the stem, and the insect is sucking the juice out of the plant and causing it to either die or turn kind of sickly. Is your Pachysandra ground cover growing in the sun? This evergreen creeper is a great plant for the shade, but will not do well in a sunny location. There is a new variety of Pachysandra which does well in the sun, however. Pachysandra green carpet was introduced from Europe. It is slightly more compact, producing glossy green leaves with a deeper green coloration and a more vigorous habit of growth. Green carpet Pachysandra is still somewhat rare and costs more. I've got a planting of green carpet that will go from here to where Nancy's standing, and it's probably 6 feet wide. Just creeps along with no special care at all. My second daughter, who lives right now in Ottawa, she works for the State Department, owns a place in Meredith, New Hampshire. I gave her some shoots from my Pachysandra, and it just hasn't done well. Well, her husband doesn't like to use fertilizer. So I said, tell Bob to fertilize that Pachysandra, and the color will improve 100%. And maybe they've done this, maybe they haven't, I do not know. but sometimes my advice is just ignored, especially by my family members. So anyway, on and on and on. Another question, we have a planting of periwinkle. A lot of people know periwinkle, but they call it myrtle, or they might call it vinca. It's a native plant, perfectly hardy, creeps along the ground. It grows about 3 inches tall, has little single blue flowers early in the spring. But we have this planting of periwinkle, which is doing well as a ground cover in a partially shaded area. That's one attribute of the periwinkle. It will grow well in sun or shade. There are patches of the planting that have started to die with the stems turning brown. This is a fungus disease, which should be easy to control with an application of Venomil. Now, some of the chemicals that I mentioned in this book are no longer available, so you've got to ignore that. And chemical names especially, they've changed this constantly. Certain materials the gardeners use to control insects and so forth are just simply no longer available because the EPA has decreed that they're dangerous to use or something like that. So anyway, Venomil may or may not be available. Another question, some of our pine trees have, what's the rest of it? Have a more than white spittle-like a spittle is a little mass of, looks like spittle on the stem of a pine tree, a young pine tree, or many other garden plants are sometimes infested by the spittle bug. The insect is inside that mass of spittle. Easy to control, doesn't do any harm really, but it might be unsightly for some people. So you can control it if you want to. There is a variegated white, they made an error here. The proofreader made a mistake and didn't correct it. But anyway, our neighbor has a large clump of peonies and has offered to give us. A few old wives' tales, and one I want to mention right away is the tale about peonies. Now, peonies are in full bloom everywhere now. As I drive around, I'll see them in people's yards and gardens, and just large, fluffy flowers that might be white or pink or red or bicolored. They're easy to grow. Sometimes a young plant will not blossom, or even an old plant might be affected with this disease that I'm going to mention. When a plant produces flower buds, when the peony plant produces these buds and the buds don't open, it's probably a disease called botrytis. And you can control botrytis. Number one, you cut the stems right to the ground in the fall, because the disease, as many diseases do, lives over in the old leaves and stems near the ground. So pruning is a control. Also, you can spray when the peony shoots just come out of the ground with a fungus control spray. But what I hear people saying quite often, in fact, there's a radio talk show host who repeats this: if the flowers don't open, you need some ants on your peonies. So what he says to do, you go to McDonald's or one of the other fast food places, and you get a couple of those little jars of jelly, and open up the jar of jelly, place it underneath your peony. This will attract more ants. The ants will crawl up the stem of your peony and make the buds open up. Yes, he has mentioned this in his column. He's mentioned this on the air. And when he goes to garden clubs, they laugh him out of the room because that's not true. The ants are only looking for the waxy substance on the peony bud, which they feed on. They have nothing to do with the peony flowers opening. But this is an old wives' tale that's been repeated over and over and over so many times that people are beginning to believe it. So just let the buyer beware. Peonies are best, this is digging and dividing peonies. And who was it? I guess it was Nancy, one of our daughters, had a house built down in Bryantville, and she wanted some peonies. And the neighbor had some, and they gave her some shoots. In the fall, it's the best time to divide peonies. She planted them, and lo and behold, they blossomed the next year. I said, Nancy, these aren't going to blossom right away. It might take them 2 or 3 years before they begin to blossom. But she got the last laugh on that one. She had flowers the very next season. But peonies are easy to grow and just long-lasting. My social studies teacher in Rockland High School was married to a lady who had a large garden. And she told me one time that she had some peony roots, some peony plants in her yard that had been there for 35 years, and they'd never been disturbed, they'd never been touched all these years, and they flowered and did very well. So a long-lasting perennial. It's one of the toughest and one of the best plants. I have a nursery catalog from 1938. I don't know where I got it, but it was in my drawer somewhere, I guess, and Marion brought it out one day, and there are a number of different kinds of plants listed in this catalog. Many more varieties in some cases than we see in nurseries today. So the peony section, I think there are 20 or 30 different varieties of peonies listed in that catalog. Some of them have the same names that we have today: Festiva Maximum, Felix Kraus, Karl Rosenfeld. These are names that I remember from when I was a kid, and they're still being grown today. Most of your nurseries will only have white-flowered peonies or red-flowered peonies. They won't have names. But in the old days, they did maintain names, and these are some of the names that I recall from all those years ago. Are there any questions? I'll try to answer them as best I can, and if I don't have an answer, I'll say so. I'll look up the answer and call you with the answer. So if you have any questions, please speak right up and raise your hand. Yes?
Foxglove. I don't know how it started, but I had foxglove and somebody was giving me. Now, how did that spread? And I know it becomes, I guess, every other year. Last year I must have had 20, 25, all over my yard. Well, this year I have maybe 8. I have a beautiful white one, and I would love to have another white one next year, but can I do that? Can I?
Well, of course, the easiest way is to go to a nursery and buy a plant. But foxglove,
And he knows a nursery just
foxglove or digitalis, this is a plant that the digitalis medicine comes from, but they don't use it anymore as far as I know, but it's a biennial. Now, there are other plants that are biennials. They grow from seed, the seedlings winter over and flower the next year, then usually those plants will die. But the seed is scattered by wind or any other nature has, any other way that nature has to spread the seed. But usually we have 200 foxglove plants blossoming in our yard right now, Marion, is that right? They're all over the place. Now, we never had that many before.
That would be last year,
So,
but not this year.
well, it's just a freak of nature. You can't depend on it. But it's a tough biennial, no insect or diseases that I know of, and very, very showy in early to mid-June when it blossoms. Just long spikes, sometimes they'll grow.
My
Oh,
white one is, it's beautiful, there are like 3 of them, and I would love to somehow make them next year too. I have some white ones, but.
I pick the seed. When the flowers fade, the seed will produce really fine seed, almost like dust. And scatter the seed, scratch it in just a little bit. You might moisten it several times, and you'll certainly have plants the next year.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to try it. I've never done that.
Okay, any other questions? Yes?
I have a general question on herbs, like, basil or rosemary or sage. What's the best way of preserving them so I can have it, through the winter? I've tried freezing, I've tried drying them out, so I'm not sure what's the best way I should take care of herbs so I can enjoy them all winter.
I know some herbs are cut as they're growing and hung up in a place like an attic or something like that where they will dry out. And I'm not really that much up on herbs. Check the internet. There's so many answers out there. Or check with Barbara Reed at the Wyman's Nursery. She's really up on perennials and annuals, much more so than I am. So, but I know that some are best cut and hung up in a dry place. Anything else? Okay, yes.
I'm sorry if you could identify this leaf.
I beg your pardon?
I was wondering if you could identify this leaf.
From here I can't. But I'll look at it a little bit later on.
I wanted a plant sale, it was at the end of the sale, and all the information was gone, so I just bought it. And I bought it, and it was like this big now, it's like 7 feet tall. And it has exfoliating bark, and that's one of the small leaves.
Does it die to the, is it a woody plant, like a shrub or a tree?
It's big, it's got a big tall branch, and the circumference of the branch is only like 2 inches, and like right now it's like 7 feet tall.
I'm not really sure. I do have a garden encyclopedia over there. You're welcome after the presentation to look through there because he has sketches of hundreds of different trees and shrubs. That's Durr's book, D-I-R-R. It should be in every town library, but it's a tremendous reference. I sometimes thumb through just for, increasing my memory as it's fading around a little bit. But you might see something like this in it. It could be snowbell.
Somebody said it was, they thought it was a catalpa tree, that grows like.
No, it's not catalpa. I can tell you what it's not, but I'm not sure what it is. But look in Durr's book later on, and maybe we can get an answer there. Yes?
I want to move some trees around my backyard and transplant them to another spot. Is there a better time of year to do that, like, you know, before, in the fall, or does it matter?
For transplanting trees to another location, the best time to do this would be when the plant is dormant, after the leaves have fallen, or early in the spring before the leaves even begin to leaf out, to appear. So if it's a sizable tree, you might want to root prune it. I think I have an article in this book on root pruning, but you cut around the tree, depending on the size of the tree, possibly 2.5 feet in diameter, slice right down, at least a foot deep. We call this root pruning, and this will force the plant to develop a more compact root system. So the next season, you do the root pruning, say now, and then in the fall, you can do the transplanting, or next year. But by root pruning, you have a much more compact root system, and there'll be less shock to the transplanting. Squash vine borers, for those who grow vegetables, a common pest. This is a borer, or an insect, that tunnels into the stem of your squash, not butternut. Butternut seems to be resistant, but summer squash and quite a few varieties of winter squash are sometimes damaged by the squash vine borer. Well, squash vine borer is a moth with clear wings, and I think it's an orange body. I haven't seen them for years because I don't grow vegetables now. But the best way to control a squash vine borer that can tunnel into the stem of your plants and kill them, or kill that part of the vine, but you spray during the month of July. I'm not sure which chemical spray will do the job now. We used to use 7, or we'd use other materials. You've got to do this when the insect is laying eggs. Timing is so important with many kinds of insects. If you don't do the spraying at the right time, you've missed the boat altogether. So that's the pest. Some people say you can slit the stem and kill the borer that's inside the stem, and just push some dirt over the cut place. Well, that's okay, but it's a chore. But by using the spray at the proper time, you can prevent damage from the squash vine borer. A checklist of things to do in the garden. Fertilize trees, shrubs, and evergreens. Now, as far as fertilizer is concerned, I never fertilize the shrubs in front of my house, what we call the foundation planting. What's going to happen when you fertilize? The plant's going to grow faster. You'll have to prune more. So don't fertilize those plants unless they're small, if they're newly planted. Fertilizer can be used on plants other than those near the foundation. Newly planted trees, shrubs, and so forth. I like to use a granular fertilizer. Just sprinkle about 2 pounds to 100 square feet. It's a light sprinkling, more or less the same rate you fertilize the lawn. So don't be too anxious to fertilize those plants near the foundation. Indoor plants. Carol asked me earlier about a plant. She showed me a picture of an indoor plant. I didn't know what it was, but to keep an indoor plant looking its best, a little sprinkling of granular fertilizer or a liquid fertilizer, dissolving your Miracle Grow or something like that in water, a tablespoon per gallon, and a good feeding once every 4 to 6 weeks. When the plant is growing, that's the best tip on fertilizing indoor plants, on fertilizing your house plants. Fertilize when they're growing. If they're in the dormant period, don't fertilize them. Let them coast along a little bit. Another tip for working in the garden, pruning. March and April are fine months to prune woody plants. Wait until after the blooming period for the flowering types, or you will sacrifice the next year's flowers. This question comes up quite often. When should I prune? Well, if it's a flowering tree or a flowering shrub, the best tip I can give you is to prune shortly after blossoming. Now, Joanne asked me earlier about pruning her PGM rhododendron, which is a commonly grown rhododendron. If you prune too late in the season, you'll be cutting off the flower buds for the next year. So do your pruning on flowering plants trees, shrubs, and so forth, right after they blossom. Then the plant will have time enough to grow and develop flower buds for the following season, because most of our early spring blooming plants have their flower buds in the fall and through the winter. So if you do your pruning then, you'll be cutting off next year's flowers. If you have a shady spot in the garden, easy to grow tuberous begonia, a great plant. Tuberous begonias are really a tuber, or like a flat bulb, and great in the shade. I quite often plant several tuberous begonia tubers in a container in a shady place in the deck or a shady place along the walkway, because they thrive where there's part shade. I've never seen tuberous begonias do well in the sun, but they certainly do well in the shade. And as a plant that's neglected, they do tend to be a little more costly than the fibrous rooted begonias. You can buy fibrous rooted begonias 6 in a 6-pack for, what, a couple dollars maybe. But each tuber of the tuberous begonia might cost, I don't know, $1 or $2. But you pay a little bit more, but you can save those tubers through the winter as a dormant bulb. You wouldn't keep them growing. You store them away in the basement or somewhere like that. Put the plant in some kind of a container, cover it with peat or sawdust, keep it kind of damp, just a little bit damp in a cool place. And the tuberous begonia is fine. You can save it from year to year. A listing of do's and don'ts for successful gardening. 1, trees and shrubs compete with your garden for food and moisture. Avoid planting near trees, especially walnuts. Now, walnut contains a chemical which will almost poison plants that are within the root zone of that walnut tree. Now, walnuts aren't commonly grown today, I realize that, but if you do have a walnut tree, be sure not to plant too close to the tree because of this chemical the tree produces. I'm saying too little fertilizer is as harmful as too much. Excuse me. If you are a smoker, always wash your hands before handling plants. Tobacco mosaic virus can be transmitted by handling. Rotate crop location each year to prevent disease. This would pertain to vegetable gardens for the most part, but don't plant the same vegetables in the same spot every year. Rotate so that if there is a disease in the soil, it won't be transmitted to your new planting. Go back and forth, have a plan for your garden, and rotate those plantings. The most efficient crops overall yield in relation to work required are tomatoes, and certainly I think you can go to any nursery, garden center, or plant retailer, and tomatoes are the most popular. Summer squash, I can't see any sense in planting summer squash plants. Onions and cucumbers. So these are some of the most efficient, as they call it, the greatest yield per square foot. Keep your garden working through spring and through fall with succession planting. So many people say, I plant around Memorial Day, and that's it. No more planting for the rest of the year. But there are many vegetable plants that can go in the ground in June, July, even August. Spinach, for instance, can be planted in August. You winter them over, and you'll have spinach for harvest early the next spring. The most water-efficient crop, that's something that residents of Hanson would be interested in because of the water ban, but the most water-efficient crops are tomatoes, peppers, and eggplant. It is best to give your garden a good soaking once a week. Our neighbor, who was a banker, he has since moved down to the Cape, but every afternoon he'd get home from work, the first thing he did was to start the water going. And he kept his plants soaked all the time, thinking this was best. Well, he had more weeds, he had less success with plants because the soil is constantly wet. And what happens then? The oxygen, plant roots do need oxygen. The oxygen is squeezed out of the soil because the pore spaces in the soil are completely saturated with water. So a good watering once a week is usually plenty. Water early in the day. And see, this banker, he was watering in the evening. And evening watering will leave moisture on the foliage, creating a breeding ground for fungus disease. So this is a good tip for your watering. Do it during the sunny part of the day. It's perfectly okay to water, and wetting the foliage will not do any harm. So just a few tips in the book on do's and don'ts for watering.
But when you just transplanted something, does it need to be watered though, like daily or for a while?
This is watering when you're transplanting. Keep the soil moist, and I say moist but not wet. So yes, when you're transplanting, you'd have to use a little more water than you normally would, but don't keep the soil too wet, just moist. Moisture is okay up to a point. Umbrella pines. I spoke to a group of kids from the junior high school one year over in East Bridgewater, and there must have been 30 or 40 kids all sitting around in a big circle. 50, 100 kids, I don't know how many there were. There was a big bunch of them. So one of my questions to the kids was, when is a pine not a pine? And right away, one of the kids spoke up. When you have an umbrella pine is not a pine, Cyadopetus, a great evergreen, no insects or diseases to worry about, no deer damage to cause trouble. Barbara, are you growing umbrella pine in your very, very extensive collection of You're not. But we have 6 or 8 umbrella pines in our garden. I never worry about them. They're foolproof. The books will sometimes say they're slow growing. Well, my umbrella pines are growing 4 to 6 or 8 inches a year. A fabulous plant. It grows kind of tall, so if you're growing it in your garden, you might want to pay attention to pruning. But I like the umbrella pine because it's foolproof. Nice dark green needles, evergreen. The umbrella pine is a great plant. Phil and I rode over to Mike Johnson's wholesale nursery to look over his crop. And Philip orders plants from Mike Johnson sight unseen, because this man has a reputation. He's in Madison, Connecticut, a wholesale nursery, but he has a reputation of growing the best of everything that he grows. So we went over there one day to see his crop of fine trees and shrubs and to see what he's going to have available for sale this fall. Well, it wasn't really necessary. It was kind of a nurseryman's day out, because we knew what his plants were going to look like before we even ordered them. Mike is always on the lookout for hardy evergreens, shrubs, trees, or ground covers to grow. His collection of dwarf evergreens is outstanding. Often Mike will pick up something new and grow it in his trial garden for a few years for evaluation. He will look for hardiness, unusual branching habit, and seasonal color, or some interesting feature, trying to determine whether the plant is different from something already available. Because there's competition at all levels of nursery trade, wholesale and retail. So the wholesale is trying to find something to grow which other wholesalers will not be growing. So if he does a better job with varieties that are unusual, he'll have more sales. Mike usually will make 4,000 or 5,000 cuttings of umbrella pine, a very unusual, slow-growing evergreen. This tree has seldom been attacked by any insect or disease. Well, that's my experience, and it's Mike's also. The problem with the umbrella pine is that only about 500 to 1,000 of those 5,000 cuttings will root. Then it takes about 5 years for these rooted cuttings to reach a saleable size, about 12 inches tall. But from that point on, I have found that umbrella pine will grow more rapidly. 4, 5, 6 inches a year is not unusual. Some plants are much easier to propagate and will grow faster, so the entire operation can be fun even though it is challenging. Honey locust, a great shade tree, little tiny leaves. You don't have to rake the leaves from the honey locust when they drop in the fall, because they're so tiny they kind of sift into the grass. So a foolproof tree, seldom attacked by insects or diseases. Philip has in front of the nursery property 5 honey locust trees along the entrance. So it just does well everywhere. Winter hardy and pretty much pest free. Azaleas. I have a question for you. Are azaleas evergreen? Nobody wants to answer that one? There are evergreen azaleas and there are non-evergreen or deciduous azaleas. And there are many, many hundreds of varieties of azaleas. I have both the evergreen forms and the deciduous forms. But I like the deciduous forms. The flowers are large. Some of them have fragrant flowers. Some of them blossom after the main season. The main season for azalea blossom is early to mid-May. Well, some of these deciduous azaleas blossom in June or even July. In fact, there's one series called the Independence series, which will blossom in early July. So just a wide range of varieties of azaleas. So look for the deciduous types. They're not as popular, but I think they should be grown more than they are. A new azalea recently introduced is called Hotshot. This is a relatively low, compact plant with good foliage, which changes to a brilliant burgundy red in the fall. So don't expect color in your garden just when the flowers are coming out, because there are some plants, and azaleas in particular, that have bright red, purplish red leaves in the fall. The flower color, this is again Hotshot. The flower color is excellent and is described as fiery, deep orange red. The flowers are large, up to 2.5 inches across, and make this plant quite spectacular when blossoming. Asparagus. We went to Plimpton last evening, and right on the Plimpton-Halifax line on Route 106, there was a vegetable stand, and they had 2 bunches of asparagus left. So I scooped up one of them, and Marion cooked the asparagus last night. A fabulous vegetable. Well, you know, you go in the supermarket, and they've got asparagus in bunches, and the stalks are about as big as your little finger, or as the size of a pencil in diameter. Probably grown in Peru, somewhere in South America, because that asparagus is on the vegetable stand year-round. But when you see asparagus freshly picked, grown by a local grower, the stalks are as big around as your thumb or bigger. I mean, that is really a treat. There's no comparison between the little spindly asparagus you see. There must be 50 stalks in a bundle over at the Shaw's when they have asparagus for sale. That is not asparagus. Or the asparagus, the frozen asparagus, or the canned asparagus, there's no comparison. But freshly picked native asparagus with a large stalk, that is super. Marion sometimes will cook it in milk, and she makes up some toast, and the asparagus with milk poured onto the freshly baked bread. That is a real treat. We'll have to have some of that very soon, Marion. I like it, so you're going to cook for me.
Can I ask a question about asparagus?
Sure.
I have asparagus that I just tied them all up today. Could I move it?
If you want to transplant the asparagus, I would do it early in the spring when the spears are just an inch above the ground, or in the fall after the feathery fronds turn brown.
Okay. And it's going to be pretty extensive underground. This is what I'm reading. The longer it is established in this garden, the more it expands underneath.
Probably.
Okay.
I have grown asparagus from seed. Seedling asparagus is going to take 2 or 3 years before it produces, edible asparagus spears. But that's the economical way to do it. Or you can buy the dry roots in the spring. Or if you know somebody that has a planting they're going to divide, you could see that person and share with them. But it's a great vegetable, and I don't think it's appreciated because people have been kind of used to the stuff in the supermarket, and there's no comparison.
I separate the asparagus. I had small asparagus ready. I can separate them to the party.
You dig up the clump, and with a garden hose, wash all the soil off the roots, and they can break it up or cut it up, as long as each division has a little eye, which will be the sprout for the next year.
I get a little more every year. I get a little more every year too.
Well, my grandmother had an asparagus bed, probably half the size of this room. And as kids, we used to go out after she said, how about some asparagus? So it had been allowed to grow into weeds, and the weeds were as thick as can be, and that is, it was a chore to cut a bunch of asparagus because the weeds had been allowed to grow in there. But if you take care of your asparagus planting, it's something that will last for many, many years and provide a tasty treat when it's ready to eat. All right, there is an article here which I wrote, spring is the ideal time to transplant deciduous plants. Well, I'd qualify that now by saying fall is equally good. So either early spring or in the early fall when the leaves have started to fall off.
The moth ball, moth flakes, keep away rabbits.
That's what I've heard. I've never tried it. The best way to answer that is to try it and see if it works.
Remember I took that box of mothballs because I didn't want the rabbits eating my plants, and I sprinkled them all around, and you came in the house and you said, "What's that smell out there?" So I went out and took it away, but it didn't make anything different. The mothballs continued to do it.
I've used a product called deer and rabbit repellent as a spray. It comes as a concentrate ready to use, or it comes in the stuff you'd mix with water. And I have excellent luck repelling deer and rabbits from my plantings. And even hosta, which is a favorite food for deer, sometimes they'll chew down every single leaf, but I spray in the spring, and again, maybe it's about time for me to put a second application on, but deer and rabbit repellent. It contains dried blood and what else? 2 or 3 materials that mix together make a fine repellent. It's kind of expensive, but it's also expensive when your plants are all chewed up. Rhubarb. We had.
Tiny, I came in for my neighbor was, he was a very big rhubarb, mine was little tiny. And I don't know what they say, I'm never kind of.
Fertilizer and mulching. Mulch of some kind. Either the bark mulch or fertilizer, well, both really. The rhubarbs you come along and in a year or two, you should have some good stalks ready for harvest. A good watering, if you can water, can't water in your town, I know where you live, but fertilizer, they used to use a shovelful of manure on top of their rhubarb plants every spring. And my father grew stalks of rhubarb that were 1.5 inches in diameter. It shouldn't be a problem to grow rhubarb, but you know, don't.
It keeps coming up, but it doesn't get any bigger. I mean, the stalks are tiny.
A general purpose fertilizer, 888 or something like that. And the fertilizer I like for all plants is one called Plant Organic. Now, I don't know whether this one is still available or not. I believe it is. But Plant Organic contains 8% nitrogen, 8% phosphorus, and 8% potash. It's a good general purpose fertilizer. I use it on everything. And just as a dry fertilizer, you don't have to mix it with water. Sprinkle it maybe 2 pounds to 100 square feet, so it's a light sprinkling, and it does a fine job for me. And here we are, broadcast fertilization, best for trees. That's on page 31. Clematis. Hundreds and hundreds of varieties of clematis. It's not clematis, but clematis is a hardy vine, pinks, reds, whites, there's even a yellow, various shades of these different colors. Pruning clematis is a question that comes up quite often. Well, there are clematis that will blossom on current season's growth. There are clematis varieties that blossom well on the previous season's growth. So how do you know which one you have? Well, you can look in a garden book if you know the variety name of your clematis, and it will list the 2 groups. If you don't know, just by observation you can tell. If the dead stems are there all winter, and in the spring, cut the dead stems right to the ground. I only prune clematis when it's leafing out by removing the dead stalks. Should grow well. Some people say spread a little lime around your clematis each year. I've never bothered with that, and I still have good luck with clematis. So many varieties and new ones every year. Tulip bulbs. What's the time to plant tulip bulbs is when they are available in the garden stores, which would be in the late summer, early fall. And once in a while, someone will come in and say, I have some tulip bulbs. Look, here they are. They're in the bag. They came from the store, and they're all shriveled up. Throw them away. You can't save them. But a plant that you've got to use maybe a chemical repellent or a fence around your tulips. When I was a kid, I had 30 or 40 different varieties of tulips. And in those days, I recommended digging them up every year after flowering, after the leaves have turned yellow. Store them in a cool, dry place, and then replant them in September. So this is the way the commercial growers will do it. But easy to grow, many varieties, but you do have to use some kind of a repellent or a fence to keep the critters away. Weed control in the lawn. Crabgrass is the #1 pest of lawns. The first thing people think of when they're maintaining a lawn. Crabgrass control can be take two forms. One is to use a crabgrass preventer. This would be a chemical that you'd use in the early spring, usually before the second mowing. It comes as a dry granular product, and it will kill the crabgrass seed as it's sprouting. The second way to control crabgrass is to use a crabgrass control when the crabgrass is growing, but before it flowers. So I say, great, use your step one. Some of your non-fertilizers are coming, step 1, 2, 3, 4. So maybe the first year you could use step 1, which will fertilize the lawn and kill crabgrass seed. The second year, you might use step 1, but I would graduate to using the spot treatment, the liquid crabgrass control. It's a lot more economical, and it'll do the job just as well. So my son would not agree with me. He likes to sell the step program, sell it all at once, but sometimes you don't need the crabgrass preventer. If you killed most of the seed that's in the ground, the little bit of seed left will grow, and then you hit it with a chemical when it's starting to grow. The same with broadleaf weeds, such as dandelions. You can use a product that will kill all the dandelions and other broadleaf weeds and fertilize at the same time, or use plain fertilizer and spot treat for dandelion control. Again, it's more economical because you don't need dandelion control where there are no weeds. So spot treat for weeds, weed control is a much more economical way to do it. Overgrown yews. Maybe the deer have not damaged your yews, your planting of yews, which are very, very commonly grown evergreen. We used to sell a trailer truckload of yews every spring. This would be hundreds of plants. I don't think my son sells a handful now because the deer feed on the yew foliage. So anyway, if you happen to have some yew plants that are overgrown, you can cut them back with a saw down to stubs, because the yew will send out new shoots, new branches from what looks like dead branches, dead stems. So it's a very effective way to control certain growth. Rhododendrons. I'll never forget the lady who lived in Carver. She wanted me to go down and put some new rhododendrons in the ground. I said, well, what's the matter with the rhododendrons you have? Oh, they're too big, they're overgrown. Well, all you have to do is go in there with a saw and cut these rhododendrons within about 2 feet of the ground, and they'll send out new growth and make a perfectly great plant within a year or two. She didn't want to wait a year or two. She wanted something immediate. So I went down and dug out the overgrown yews, the overgrown rhododendrons. I saved them. I kept them in my truck, planted new ones, and I took these stubs with roots attached to my garden, planted them, and 2 years later I had some perfectly fine rhododendrons. So, I charged her for the new plants, I charged her for the labor, and I got a big bonus in these plants, and they're still there today. So you can cut rhododendrons back to a foot, 2 feet above the ground, and they'll regrow from the stub that's left.
You've been telling everybody what you do. Now, it's time for a laugh, I think. And I think maybe you ought to tell them about your grandpa, who ran a nursery, and tell them how he hired help and what he required them to do.
Well, my grandfather was a nursery foreman in Rockland. The land is now developed as a housing development, if you know Wyman Fields in Rockland. But I remember when I was a kid, one of his favorite expressions was, this is when they paid about 50 cents an hour for labor to work in the nursery. But he would never hire a man who smoked a pipe. You think why? Because he spent too much time lighting it. That was one of his favorite sayings. And another one was, no colored water in this farm. He didn't want people drinking on the job. So he was a taskmaster, he was a foreman and a propagator. I can remember sitting up in the little room up in the barn where he was propagating lilacs. In those days, lilacs were grafted. So he'd have the root system of privet. If you know what privet is, it's a hardy shrub, sometimes used as a hedge. And he'd have the scion, the above ground part of the plant. This would be the lilacs, and he'd make a slit in the underground part of that stem, insert the lilac twig, the scion, wrap it up with string, and dip it in wax. Then he put these newly grafted plants in the barn cellar where it was damp and bury them in the sand. So this was a lengthy process. Today they make cuttings of lilacs and root them under mist in a greenhouse. A very, very simple process, but they didn't know about things like that in those days. So the grafting process was something that I used to sit there for hours watching him. And some of those varieties of lilacs are still being grown today, by the way, like peonies and a few other plants that, you know, they've developed new varieties, but sometimes the old varieties are still available. I can prove it by showing you that 1938 nursery catalog. Rugosa rose hips. Now, Rugosa rose is like a wild rose, very, very spiny. My daughter, I think it's Nancy, wants to plant some Rugosa rose plants, and I don't know why, but the hips, the seed pods of the Rugosa rose contain a large amount of vitamin C. This sometimes is called a beach rose. It'll grow in very, very poor sandy soil and just as tough as can be, but there's another use for the plant. Picking those hips, those seed pods, and you can, I don't know how they do it, but they have a lot of vitamin C. All right, another question that was asked, and I answered in the column. We would like to grow shrubs that are slow growing and do not require a great deal of care. Well, this is a common question. I was asked this over and over. So my answer in this case was some of the dwarf conifers make fine garden plants. A very slow-growing conifer, really a miniature, is the golden sprite false cypress. Our plant is growing at the rate of about an inch a year. There are also dwarf forms of hemlock, pine, and spruce. Some of the semi-dwarf cultivars of spirea make fine specimens and require little or no care. Well, there's a very, very popular evergreen called the Alberta spruce. And I've seen places where they planted a row of them like a hedge. The Alberta spruce is considered a dwarf, but it's not a dwarf. It's a slow-growing evergreen. It probably could be considered a dwarf in some cases, but a real dwarf evergreen only grows about an inch a year. Well, the Alberta spruce grows 2 to 3 inches a year. So there's a place down here on Main Street near the new restaurant, Meadowbrook, and they have planted Alberta spruce across the front of the house. The next time you're down on Route 27, before you get to the Meadowbrook restaurant, on the right-hand side, you'll see this row of Alberta spruces in front of this house. Sure, they're slow growing, but they're kind of boring when you have nothing else planted in your foundation planting. But there was a group of plant scientists. They're always looking for new plants. So they're in Alberta province in Canada about 100 years ago. Well, as they were about to get onto the train to get back to Boston, where they came from, they saw an evergreen, or a plant that appeared to be an evergreen, growing in the wild. And they took cuttings, or they dug up the plant, I'm not sure which. And this plant became the Alberta spruce that we know today. Very, very slow growing, but it's not a dwarf, it's not a miniature, it's simply a slow growing conifer, or slow growing evergreen. So you have to watch names sometimes, and that person down here on Main Street thought they were getting some very, very slow growing plants. They did not. As I recall, looking at those plants as I drive by, they're today about 3 or 4 feet tall, and they're going to get to be 12 feet tall eventually in another 25 years. So plant names can be confusing. So don't always look at the label and expect it to tell the truth. We recently visited the garden in Howardsport, where we saw an outstanding collection of dwarf evergreens, Japanese maples, and ornamental grasses. This is a tremendous garden. I don't know whether it's still being maintained or whether Mr. Elliott is still living. But there were plants of every conceivable shape, size, and color. Some grew flat on the ground, others were weeping types, and many were slow-growing miniatures. The owner of this unique Japanese-style garden was John Elliott, retired after a long career at sea. He started his collection only 15 years ago. Many of the plants are not available from nurseries in eastern Massachusetts, and Mr. Elliott obtained specimens from mail-order nurseries in many states. The collection now includes nearly 400 species and varieties, all growing on an area considerably smaller than an acre. So you can imagine how small many of these plants are. There were prostrate blue spruces, globe white pines, weeping hemlocks, dwarf rhododendrons, weeping blue atlas cedars, a dwarf ginkgo, I wish I knew where he got that one, an espaliered firethorn, golden cypress, and many other plants, rarely seen in home gardens. 2 hours was hardly enough time to see everything. I thought I'd tell you about a periodical that I think every gardener should subscribe to. This is called Grassroots. It's available from the university. It's $10 for 8 issues. The magazine or the periodical comes out during the growing season. I think it's from June until October, March to October. It's only either $8 or $10. Grassroots. Go on the internet. The UMass site will describe the publication, and what the price is right now, I am really not sure. But a lot of good information. This particular issue, that for each issue they'll tell you what to be doing that month in the garden. For instance, August is a month to sow seed of mustard greens. I don't know who eats mustard greens. But anyway, if you want to grow them, August is a time to sow the seed. They'll be ready for harvest in about 40 days. Substitute the spicy leaves for some of the lettuce and fresh salads. Cultivate crusted garden soils to allow water from August thunderstorms to soak in. Mulches of untreated grass clippings or straw will prevent. That's something else to think about. If you're treating your lawn with some kind of a weed killer, don't use the grass clippings as a mulch around your plants. Another thing about cutting your lawn. Throw away the grass catcher. When you mow your lawn and you collect those clippings, the clippings are a great source, you could say, for fertilizer, because nitrogen is one of the most important elements for growth of your lawn. What's in the clippings? A lot of nitrogen. So the people who collect all those clippings and throw them away are good fertilizer customers. So the nurseryman loves to see them come in because they're throwing away what could be considered fertilizer. So don't collect those clippings. Leave them. Take the grass catcher and hang it up in the garage. Allow over mature green beans to fully ripen. Cut down the stems of hollyhocks. Mulch spring planted trees. So all kinds of information for each month when the garden clippings comes out. And then a featured article each month. This one is about the longhorn beetle. And the longhorn beetle is an insect that tunnels into the stem of trees and kills a tree. They found them in the Worcester area a few years ago, and they cut down 25 or 30,000 of these trees because that's the only method that's been known to control the longhorn beetle. Where did it come from? The beetle came from the Orient. Well, how did it get into this country? It hitchhiked in wooden pallets. And the stuff from China or Japan is stacked on these wooden pallets, and they didn't know that there were beetles inside those pallets. And when the beetles emerged, they suddenly began feeding on the trees that were in that area, killing the trees, so it became a very serious pest. So they cut down the trees, and the last I know, there was no other way to control them. So the Asian longhorn beetle is a whole page on that. And then why trees shed leaves in midsummer. So the garden clippings, it's an economical way to learn an awful lot about gardening. Another way is to visit the UMass website, and they have a pest of the month, I believe it is, Again, it's free. Just fire up your computer, and the UMass website will tell about the insects that are troublesome that month or that week. So if you're really dedicated to controlling insects and doing the best job you can in your garden, visit that website. I'm not sure the URL address, but a computer literate person could tell you how to find that site. So my computer is set up so all I punch is, it comes automatically. So the UMass has a lot of good information, and there's no charge for it.
Do you have an effective means of getting rid of the lily beetle without just digging up all the lilies and throwing them away?
Yeah, the lily leaf beetle infests lilies, not daylilies, but the lily that grows from a bug. And it's a serious pest of lilies. I've seen lilies with nothing left but the stalk. But that bright crimson beetle, easy to control with a proper chemical. I don't know what it is, but you can control it. And you get to start early in the season when the insect is first starting to feed.
Somebody said that somebody told me that they actually deposit the eggs in the soil, so in the spring the eggs are already there. So
Probably, yes. Yeah, some insects are very sneaky. They you don't know where they're going to be or when they're going to be there. But sites such as, well, either the Garden Clippings newsletter or the UMass website will give you a lot of hints on what to use and when to use it.
Where we in this town cannot use water, many houses cannot use water. Is there some way that they can get it out somehow and give those plants water that really need them?
Mulching is probably the best alternative. A good heavy mulch, 2 to 3 inches of mulch around all your plantings will hold what moisture there is there. Other than that, I don't have an answer. You can drill a well. I can do your water in the middle of the night. But it certainly is a problem where they have water restrictions.
Boy, that's cheap.
Yeah, that's kind of expensive. Here's another article. Dr. Hall spent years calling on equipment companies trying to convince them to manufacture his robot lawnmower. Now, companies are calling him. Hall, the director of the Center for Robotics Research at the University of Cincinnati, has developed a robot lawnmower. I'm negotiating with 6 companies, Hall says. The mower could be ready to market in 2 or 3 years. One question which has to be answered is liability. Although he says the robot mower is potentially safer than today's mowers, the issue cannot be ignored. The mower is safer primarily because it decreases human contact with the machine. Lawnmower accidents hurt more than 50,000 Americans annually. Now, as I recall, the robot lawnmower is kept in a little shed out on the edge of his lawn. And the electronic eye can sense when the grass is tall enough to be mowed. So at that point, the mower fires itself up, goes out into the lawn area, clips all the grass, and when the grass is all clipped, it goes back into its little shed. What could be simpler than that? So whether this machine is actually on the market yet or not, but several years ago he was developing it. Lawn care employees shouldn't feel threatened by the robot. Hall says the machine will free up people and work in other areas of the landscape. Besides that, it will create a cottage industry for people to program or repair the robots. Poison ivy is a vicious pest if you don't know what to do about it. Easy to control poison ivy with Roundup, a very safe chemical to use. You spray the leaves after they emerge in the spring. Be careful using something like Roundup. Don't spray your garden plants, but I have used Roundup for many years and I've had excellent luck with it, and I find that it's safe to use. But following the directions on the label is the best advice that I can give. But Roundup is a non-selective weed killer. It will kill practically everything you spray with it. So just be careful in your garden areas that you don't spray what you don't want to damage.
I thought one time that you could burn it and that that was the worst thing.
I'd say no, because the chemical that's in the poison ivy leaves can be in the smoke. So be very careful doing something like that.
What about some of, you see it on the internet of, you take vinegar and dish detergent and pepper flakes, and you ever try any of those?
No, I haven't.
Okay, I didn't think so.
Fact and fiction concerning insects. Insect fact versus fiction, so who cares? Entomologists do. No one else seems to be willing to stand up and take the poor insect side of things. Most people probably think of insects as being collectively pests. Remember, though, that very few insect species are genuine pests. Most are harmless or even beneficial. It will be good to debunk a few insect-related myths. Myth, dragonflies, and when I was a kid, we used to think they were what do they call them? Darting flies. We were scared to death of dragonflies. Can sting, sew their lips together. That's the myth. Dragonflies are not only absolutely harmless, they are exceptionally beneficial, consuming vast numbers of mosquitoes. A myth, all mosquitoes are pests. First off, those male mosquitoes that do feed don't do so on blood, but imbibe nectar. In addition, there are some mosquito species in which neither sex feeds on blood. One species is beneficial. Its larvae prey on other mosquito larvae. Myth, caterpillars make cocoons, then turn into butterflies. Fact, caterpillars destined to become butterflies do so as naked pupae called chrysalids. The larvae of moths and many other insects make cocoons. Myth, earwigs are deadly insects that will crawl into your ear and, well, you can imagine the rest. Fact, earwigs can be real pests. They will eat flowers and just about anything else that doesn't move fast enough. When numerous enough, they can become nuisance pests indoors. They do not, however, go about looking for ways to penetrate people's ears to deafen them. Diazinon granules, no longer available, will control this pest when found outdoors. Scatter the granules where the earwigs are found near your plantings. Viburnums. There are many, many species of viburnum. One that I recommended to Joanne a number of years ago was a sea-bowl viburnum. And when the buds begin to expand, it looks like broccoli. And I think Joanne calls this the broccoli shrub. She sent me a picture of it just the other day. But the sea-bowl viburnum, one of many, the flowers are white, but very colorful berries, very dependable. It does grow rather tall. How tall is yours, Joanne? 8 feet tall now, something like that?
Bigger.
Bigger than that, okay. So,
20 feet.
but you can prune it if you want to, and it certainly isn't a pest and very colorful when it blossoms.
Smells nice.
But the one that everybody knows is the May flowering viburnum, which blossoms in May. We have one right in front of our house. The Mayflower viburnum or the Calisai viburnum. We have the compact variety, very fragrant, pale pink to white flowers in the early spring. Not too much fruit on the Mayflower viburnum, but it is a great plant for flowers. Doesn't grow real tall, and as I said, the fragrance of the flowers is outstanding. The double file viburnum. They're in blossom right now as you drive around. If you see plants with branches that are kind of horizontal to the ground, that may be the double file viburnum. It's a shrub or small tree up to 8 or 10 feet in height and about the same width. It might make a good substitute for the flowering dogwood without the problems associated with that popular tree. The flat horizontal branching habit of the double file viburnum is distinctive throughout the year, especially when the flat flower clusters line their branches like swallows on a power line. The berries in the fall are red before turning black. The cranberry bush viburnum produces red berries which are showy in the fall until eaten by birds. It is also favored by some people who like to pick the berries and make them into a unique preserve. The cranberry bush viburnum has large white flower clusters in blossom right now, which are typical of most viburnums. It is one species which tolerates fairly wet soil. So on, many species and varieties of viburnum. And Dr. Egolf, who was at the National Arboretum down in D.C., spent many years hybridizing viburnums, and he introduced several different, new varieties, I should say. Roses, there are thousands. In fact, the national flower now is the rose. But a few years ago, a hybridizer was working with roses, and he developed a new series of hybrid roses called Knockout. In fact, it's almost the entire production of some rose nurseries, because Knockout rose is resistant to diseases, it's winter hardy, it's just a good rose. It comes in red, pink, white, yellow, but the red one is the most popular. Knockout rose, it's a great one. One time, a professional turf expert, that's grass, lawns, gave a presentation, and he was talking about the different kinds of fertilizer, when to use fertilizer, and his statement was, if you're going to fertilize your lawn once, do it in the fall. Many people fertilize their lawns only in the spring, but fall is the best time if you're only going to fertilize once. Now, if you want to get into a program to maintain the best lawn, you might fertilize 3 or 4 times a year. I used to tell people, fertilize every time. If you want a real good lawn, foolproof and a no-brainer, fertilize every time we have a holiday. That will be Patriots' Day, Memorial Day, 4th of July could be a light feeding, Columnist Day, and Veterans Day. So 5 feedings a year. The golf courses will fertilize even more than that. But every time we have a holiday, apply some lawn fertilizer for the best looking lawn. Irrigation systems. The first thing a person does when they have a new irrigation system, when you can water in your town, but they'll set up their irrigation system to water every 3rd day, maybe twice a week, maybe once a week. Well, a good soaking once a week is all that most lawns need. But the person with the programmed irrigation system is going to tend to water more often. Their fertilizer bill is going to be higher because some of the elements in the soil, some of the nutrients will be leached away. They'll have more weeds because the soil is constantly moist. And what does a weed seed want but a nice moist soil? So you can overdo a good thing sometimes. A quiz. A veteran gardeners test your IQ or your high HQ, horticultural quotient. The mulched area around an established plant should be A, as large as an old tractor tire, B, just large enough to keep lawnmowers away, C, as large as possible, preferably 2 and beyond the plant's drip line, D, about 5 feet in diameter. So what's your answer? A mulched area of any size has some benefit, but for water conservation, temperature moderation, and elimination of weed competition, it is much more effective if all the area under and somewhat beyond the plant's canopy is covered by mulch. So as wide as the spread is on your tree or your shrub, mulch that entire area. Which of the following is the best soil amendment for loosening compacted soil? A, sand, B, composted manure or garden debris, C, old charcoal and ashes from the barbecue, D, autumn leaves. And the answer there would be, contrary to popular belief, sand is not nearly as effective in loosening soil as coarse, composted organic material. Question 3. You want to put in a new garden. The best time to till the area for the first time is as soon as possible in the spring, March or earlier, B, April, C, anytime but only when there have not been heavy showers, D, October to November, the fall before. And the answer would be the fall before, because soil moisture conditions are usually better. It is usually too wet in the spring. Freezing and thawing will benefit the tilled soil, and organic matter tilled in will have a head start on breaking down. Organic matter, what is this? Could be peat, could be compost, could be manure, could be a cover crop. And I think many people miss the boat on cover crops in their vegetable garden. Late in the summer, get some winter rye seed and scatter it between the plants that are still there, rake it in just a tiny bit and moisten it if you can, and then the rye plants will grow 3, 4, 5, 6 inches, 8 inches tall. The plant will stay all winter. It's winter hardy. In the spring, you till this cover crop into the ground. It's a cheap way to build organic material in the soil, and everything will be better in the garden. For the best and healthiest bluegrass lawn, fertilize often throughout the growing season, water regularly and deeply, and mow at 2 inches in height. Seed fertilize once or twice in the fall, water deeply only during dry spells, and mow at 3 or 4 inches in height. Or fertilize when you have time, water once a week, mow before holidays and when company is coming. The answer, A or B. Either is okay, but the second is better. This will be throughout the growing season, or watering regularly and deeply, and mow at 2 inches in height. Congratulations if you get all 4 questions right. You are a knowledgeable gardener and have won a free bag of peanut hull mulch to use around your mulberry tree. Oh, by the way, when we were kids, we used to sing a nursery rhyme called Ring Around the Mulberry Tree. Was that what it was called? The mulberry bush. Well, that's right. The mulberry is a tree, not a bush. So that nursery rhyme was wrong. But I do have a weeping mulberry, and the branches weep right down to the ground. That one is really unique. But the old nursery tales sometimes tell a wrong story. All right, here's the article on asparagus. Container gardens. If space for a vegetable garden is limited, if you do not have a sunny spot in the yard, if you live in an apartment or a condo, container gardening might be a method to grow vegetables. Choose any sort of container. It must have good drainage. If not, drill holes along the sides and bottom to allow excess water to drain. Wooden containers, unless made of redwood or cypress, should be painted with a wood preservative such as cuprinol. Your container should be large enough to accommodate the roots of the plants you wish to grow. Generally, this means a depth of at least 1 foot and a width the same or larger. Plants will quickly grow an extensive root system, and a small container will require more frequent watering. A commercial soil mix, such as Peter's professional potting soil or ready earth, could be used, or you can mix your own growing soil. And on and on and on about growing plants in containers. Climbing hydrangea. A lot of people don't know there's a climbing hydrangea. But we were driving down Elm Street. Elm Street runs from Moe's Restaurant all the way down to Halifax. And there's a tree partway along in front of a house with a white picket fence. And you can't miss that house on the right inside. There's a climbing hydrangea that goes as high as these light fixtures. Pure white flowers completely covering the trunk. That is quite a sight. So it's worth a trip down Elm Street someday to see that climbing hydrangea. So on and on and on. Hopefully, if you do get one of these books, you enjoy it. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned hydrangea. I have problems with hydrangea. Where I lived before, I could get this big blue hydrangea. I have tried to put in this white one. It's supposed to put it in my lawn, and it does fine for the year, but it doesn't come back. And then the next year, I have to put in a new one. I've done it twice now. So I'm wondering, is there a particular soil condition for hydrangeas that I have to be more aware of up in this area?
I'm sorry, I didn't get your question at all.
I'm wondering if there's a particular soil condition I need to be aware of in this area to make sure hydrangeas will take here. Because I've had problems the past couple of years. Just one location. Nothing.
Well, people used to come in the nursery all the time, and they had trouble with a blue hydrangea not flowering. So I said, the best thing for you to do is to move to Nantucket Island, where the blue hydrangea is never a problem. They blossom every year.
I just came from I moved from the Cape and I got a beautiful blue. But I tried a white one and I can't seem to get the white one. Is there a particular soil need for white hydrangeas to grow or other ones? Or should I just switch to a different kind of hydrangea?
There's a new variety of white hydrangea called Incredible. And the flowers can be as much as a foot in diameter. White, which is something that many hydrangea growers are not interested in, but there's a new series of hydrangeas called the Endless Summer, developed at Bailey Nurseries in St. Paul. No problem with flowering. They'll flower every year. You can cut them right to the ground in the early spring, and they'll grow back and flower that year. So many, many varieties of hydrangeas coming along, blue ones, pink ones, white ones, but I like the white Incredible very, very much. I've had good luck. In fact, it came from Joanne. She brought it down from a nursery near Portland, and it has done well in the 3 or 4 years we've had it.
I'll have to try that. Thank you.
Any other questions? Well, if anybody's interested in a copy of Grassroots, they're here. They're $20 each. And I'll be glad to sign a copy for you.